She found a dying boy in an alley. She made one phone call. Everything changed. Amara Okafor wasn't supposed to be on Franklin Avenue that night. The county hospital had been chaos. A 17-car pileup on the interstate had consumed every bed, every doctor, every ounce of her focus for 8 hours straight. She'd volunteered for the overtime, desperate to chip away at her mother's medical bills back in Lagos, where her younger siblings depended on her remote financial support. At 23, Amara carried the weight of a family on shoulders, still learning what it meant to survive alone in Chicago. The hospital had been a battlefield, paramedics wheeling in stretchers faster than the triage nurses could process them. A woman with a compound fracture screaming for her children. A man with a crushed chest. His breathing labored, his eyes searching for hope that Amara couldn't provide. She'd worked 12 hours with no break, no bathroom reprieve, no moment to acknowledge that she was witnessing the edge of human fragility. The senior attending had pulled her aside during a brief lull around hour 9. Dr. Gonzalez was a woman who'd worked in emergency medicine for 23 years, who had seen everything the city could throw at human bodies, and she looked at Amara with something that might have been concern or might have been warning. "You can't save everyone," Dr. Gonzalez had said, watching Amara's hands shake as she tried to start in 4 on a trauma patient. "The ones you lose will haunt you, but the ones you save, they're why you keep showing up." Amara had nodded, swallowing the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her and return to the chaos. The money didn't make up for it. Almost did, but not quite. She cut through the alley, not because it was smart, but because she'd done it 100 times before, and poverty doesn't grant the luxury of fear. The January cold bit through her scrubs. She'd forgotten her coat in her locker during the chaos of triage. Hadn't even thought to retrieve it before rushing out of the building. Her hands were raw from the hospital's industrial soap. Her feet ached from standing on concrete. Her mind was already calculating the deposit she'd make tomorrow. Another $2,000 toward her mother's treatment. The alley smelled like garbage and desperation. Like every alley in this neighborhood, a mixture of rotting food, human waste, and the particular odor of poverty that Chicago's wealthy neighborhoods never acknowledged. Street lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved like living things. Amara had learned to walk quickly through these spaces to keep her head down to make herself invisible. That's when she saw him. Not a pile of clothes, not discarded garbage. A boy's expensive winter coat draped like a funeral shroud across his shoulders. His dark skin turned ashen beneath the flickering security light. His breathing was shallow, wrong, the kind of wrong that made her nurse's instinct scream. The visceral recognition that death was present in this alley, that this body was in the process of shutting down. She didn't think. Her body moved on instinct, muscle memory overriding rational thought. She approached carefully. Never know who or what you might encounter in alleys. But when she saw his face, she saw only vulnerability. A teenager, probably 14, maybe 15. Expensive sneakers, designer watch. The kind of kid who grew up without understanding that the world could hurt him. Until now, she knelt beside him, her scrubs absorbing the dirty snow of the Chicago alley. She checked his pulse, weak, rapid, concerning. She started her mental catalog of symptoms, the clinical assessment her nursing professors had drilled into her during hundreds of simulated scenarios. Cold skin, rapid shallow breathing, a medical alert bracelet on his left wrist. She moved closer, reading it through the darkness. Type 1 diabetic, critical glucose sensitivity. The continuous glucose monitor on his left wrist showed a number that made her blood turn to ice. 35 milligrams per deciliter. Normal range was 70 to 100. Below 54 was dangerous. Below 40 was life-threatening. He was below 40. "Hey," she whispered, her Nigerian accent cutting through the urban silence, softer than usual. The way she learned to speak to terrified people in the air. "Can you hear me? Don't move. I'm a nurse. You're going to be okay." His pupils were dilating. Hypoglycemic shock. The brain was already suffering from glucose deprivation. If she didn't intervene in the next 5 minutes, he'd seize. Then brain damage, then death. The cascade was inevitable once it started. Amara's hands moved on muscle memory born from countless rotations through the hospital's endocrinology wing. She opened his designer backpack, her fingers searching with practice efficiency. She found the emergency kit, pristine, professionally organized, probably cost more than her monthly rent, and located the glucose tab dispenser. She placed 2 tabs under his tongue, supporting his head, keeping his airway clear. Then she waited 30 seconds, 60 seconds. His face was still gray. She was starting to consider her options. Would anyone in this neighborhood have a phone? Would 911 actually help in a place like Franklin Avenue? Would they even care about a kid like this? When his breathing began to change, deeper, more regular, the immediate crisis beginning to resolve, that's when she noticed the phone premium, obscenely expensive, the kind of phone that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. The lock screen showed only one emergency contact displayed in bold white letters. Father, not a name, not dad, not even papa. Just that single word, like a title worn by someone too important for names. Someone so powerful that they didn't need to be called anything else. Amara hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she weighed the options. Call an ambulance and watch this kid die while waiting for help in a neighborhood where ambulances took 20 minutes minimum. Call his father and enter a world she didn't understand. Call the police and risk complications she couldn't predict. She thought of her own father, dead 3 years now from malaria, that could have been treated if they'd had money for proper medical care. She thought of how she'd held his hand in a Lagos hospital while he died because they couldn't afford the medication that would have saved him. She thought of promises she'd made to herself about never letting someone die when she had the power to intervene. Then she pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice. In the silence of the connection, she heard her own heartbeat, heard the distant wail of a siren blocks away, heard her own survival instincts screaming that she was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. A man answered before the second ring. Gene Blackwood. Even his voice was expensive, a blend of Korean precision and American power, each syllable cut like a diamond. Daniel. This isn't Daniel, Amara said, her voice steadier than her hands. My name is Amara Okafor. I'm a nurse in training, and I found your son collapsed in an alley on Franklin Avenue. His continuous glucose monitor shows critical hypoglycemia. He's been unconscious for approximately 5 minutes. His breathing is compromised. She was speaking the language of medicine, using clinical distance as a shield against the fear coursing through her nervous system. Detach from emotion, present the facts, let the data do the emotional work. The silence stretched like a held breath. She could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost feel him calculating through the phone line. She imagined him somewhere in Chicago's wealthy neighborhoods, in a penthouse or mansion, suddenly confronted with the reality that his son was dying in an alley in one of the city's most dangerous areas. When Gene spoke again, his voice had transformed into something that made her understand with crystalline clarity that this man wasn't used to hearing no. He was used to hearing yes. He was used to people obeying. He was used to power. How old are you? You should be running. He'll die if I do. Amara replied simply. His blood sugar is too low. He needs more glucose, and he needs someone to stay with him until stay exactly where you are. Don't run. Don't call anyone else. I'm 8 minutes away. The line went dead. Amara's rational mind was already running calculations. This was how women disappeared in alleys. This was how good intentions led to trafficking statistics. This was how people like her, alone, foreign, and poor, became invisible until someone found their body in an abandoned warehouse months later. But the boy's breathing was getting worse. His lips were turning gray. His glucose would continue to drop without intervention. She administered another glucose tab, monitoring his vital signs with the portion of her brain that still functioned on clinical training. The rest of her mind was spinning through scenarios, each one worse than the last. She thought about texting her roommate, creating a record of where she was, but her phone had died hours ago during the chaos at the hospital. She stayed. The alley felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. A cat emerged from behind a dumpster, regarded her with yellow eyes, and disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, she heard music. Someone's radio playing salsa. The rhythm incongruous with the life or death drama playing out in the frozen darkness. Daniel's eyelids fluttered. His glucose monitor showed 48 milligrams per deciliter. Still dangerous, but climbing. She kept her hand on his pulse, feeling the rhythm strengthen, feeling life reassert itself against the void that had been pulling him under. Gene Blackwood didn't arrive like a concerned father. He arrived like an invasion. The black SUV pulled to the curb at exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Amara knew because she'd been counting, her anxiety measuring time in seconds, her fear creating precise metrics. 3 men emerged in synchronized precision, 2 positioning themselves with the casual posture of people trained in violence, while the third moved towards Amara with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. He was tall, the kind of tall that made ordinary men recalibrate their understanding of presence. His coat was charcoal wool, the kind that cost more than Amara's monthly rent. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were identical to the boy's, the exact same dark, penetrating gaze, except his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen things that killed the softness in a person. Amara noticed other things in that first moment of assessment. The way he moved like a predator, conserving energy, the way his bodyguards positioned themselves, creating a perimeter without being told. The way he assessed the alley in a single sweeping glance, cataloging exits and threats with the efficiency of someone trained in tactical operations. Amara Okafor, he said, not asking, confirming. His accent was barely present, worn smooth by years in America, but the clipped efficiency of Korean remained in his consonants. The precise enunciation of someone who viewed language as a tool to be wielded. I'm Gene Blackwood. Thank you for staying. There was no warmth in the thank you. It was strategic, tactical, the way someone thanks a business associate for completing a transaction. He knelt beside Daniel with the efficiency of someone who had done this before multiple times. His hands were scarred, not from accidents, but from intentional violence. The kind of scars you got from fighting people, from control, from power expressed through physical domination. Daniel's diabetes is type 1 onset, incredibly unstable, Gene explained, not to her, but as a way of establishing his competence, his control. He was performing competence for an audience of one Amara, establishing that he understood this world, that he had dealt with this crisis before, that he was in control. He's had it since he was 8 years old. Most type 1s are manageable with standard protocols. His aren't. He produced a glucose injection pen from his inner coat pocket. The movements practiced, ritualized, found the vein in Daniel's neck with surgical precision. His fingers were gentle but authoritative, the way a surgeon's would be. He administered the injection like a man who had practiced this procedure 1,000 times. Within 90 seconds, Daniel's eyelids fluttered. Within 2 minutes, his pupils constricted. Color returned to his face. The gray pallor replaced by something resembling health. Daniel's voice was confused, slurred. The sound of someone emerging from unconsciousness into a world that didn't yet make sense. You forgot your emergency kit again, Gene said, his tone carrying the weight of parental frustration mixed with something deeper, something that looked like fear. The authentic raw fear of a parent who had almost lost a child. That's the 3rd time this month. I thought I could make it home. You thought wrong. You almost died. You would be dead in 10 minutes if this woman hadn't found you. Amara watched the interaction with the trained eye of someone who had spent years observing family dynamics in hospital rooms. There was love here, complicated and damaged, but genuine. Jin's hand trembled slightly as he helped Daniel sit up. A microscopic betrayal of the terror he'd felt during the drive to this alley. The tenderness in the way he helped his son to his feet contradicted everything else about him. For a moment, Amara saw something human beneath the tailored suit and scarred knuckles. A father, terrified, grateful. Then Gene turned to her, and that humanity vanished like smoke. Why didn't you call an ambulance? There are no ambulances in this neighborhood at night, Amara replied. They take 20 minutes minimum. Your son wouldn't have survived it. Gene studied her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen being cataloged in a laboratory. He was calculating something, weighing her, assessing her value like a businessman appraising an asset. You're not American, he observed. Nigerian, Lagos originally, and you didn't run. No, that's unusual. In medicine, we don't run from people who need help, Amara said, her jaw tightening. Even when it's terrifying. Something flickered across his face, a recognition perhaps, or an evaluation. She passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. He reached into his coat pocket, and Amara's entire nervous system went into overdrive. People who moved, like Gene Blackwood, didn't typically carry guns in their coat pockets, but they carried other things that could change a life, things that could erase a life. For 3 seconds, she genuinely believed he might be reaching for a weapon. He withdrew a business card. It was thick, Expensive, cream-colored with lettering and silver. Nothing but a phone number, no name, no title, no corporation or business designation. Just 10 digits that somehow felt more powerful than any name could have been. "Call this number tomorrow morning at 9, he said. "I have a proposition for you." "I don't need." Amara started. "You do," he interrupted, not unkindly. "Everyone needs something. I suspect you need it more than most." He placed the card in her hand. Her palm was shaking, though she tried to hide it, and walked back to the SUV. Daniel, still groggy but conscious, looked back at her with an expression that suggested he understood something Amara didn't. A warning maybe, or a prayer. The SUV pulled away into the Chicago night, leaving Amara alone on the frozen sidewalk, the business card burning in her palm like it had weight, like it had consequence. She stood there for 10 minutes, unable to move, her heart still racing, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The card felt warm despite the freezing temperature. Felt alive. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're being watched. It's for your protection. Go home. Don't speak about what happened. Call the number at 9. And Miss Okafor, thank you for my son's life." Amara walked home through streets that suddenly felt different. She noticed the car that pulled away from the curb 2 blocks behind her. Noticed the man in the coffee shop window who seemed to be watching her reflection. The city had changed, or she had changed, or both. In her tiny apartment, her roommate was already asleep. Amara sat on her bed holding the business card, understanding that she was standing at a crossroads. Tomorrow morning at 9, she could call that number and step into a world she didn't understand. Or she could ignore it, pretend this night never happened, continue her small, struggling life. She thought of her mother's medical bills, thought of her brother's diagnosis, thought of Dr. Gonzalez's words. "The ones you save, they're why you keep showing up." She set an alarm for 8:45 a.m. The Blackwood residence wasn't a house. It was a statement of power made manifest in stone and glass. Architecture as intimidation, wealth as weapon. The gates opened as Amara's ancient Honda pulled into the circular drive as if they'd been expecting her, because she realized with a chill they had been watching. All night, all morning. Security cameras positioned throughout the city had tracked her movements from the alley to the hospital parking garage to her apartment to this moment. A security guard checked her ID at the gate. The only moment of doubt appeared in his expression when he saw her information. Temporary resident visa, employment authorization pending. Graduate of a community nursing program. His jaw tightened slightly, as if assessing whether she was worth admitting. She was admitted. The driveway curved through manicured grounds that looked like they required a full-time staff to maintain. Amara's Honda looked like a refugee from a junkyard parked beside the fountain. An ornate marble structure featuring what appeared to be a Korean dragon, water cascading from its mouth in an endless loop. The mansion's interior was all marble and mahogany, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The entryway alone was larger than her entire apartment. A woman introduced as Mrs. Lee, the housekeeper, met her in the foyer with tea that smelled like jasmine and power. She was probably in her 60s, with a kind face of someone who had learned to survive in this household by becoming invisible. "Blackwood is ready for you," Mrs. Lee said gently, her accent suggesting she was originally from Taiwan or mainland China. "He's in his study, second door on the left." As Mrs. Lee guided her through the hallway, Amara noticed details. Family photographs and expensive frames showing Daniel at various ages. A woman who appeared in the early photos but disappeared after Daniel turned 12. The same woman whose absence felt like a wound in the house's architecture. "That's Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Lee said softly, noticing Amara's gaze. "She passed 3 years ago. Blackwood hasn't removed the photographs. I think he needs the reminder." Amara's hands were shaking as she walked down the hallway. She'd made a decision at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling of her shared apartment in a building that regularly lost heat in winter that she would refuse the offer. Whatever it was, whatever Jean Blackwood wanted, it would come with a price she couldn't afford to pay. But her mother's hospital bills were $47,000 and climbing. And her youngest brother, Dee, just been diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, and winter in Chicago was coming, and her apartment's landlord had already warned about the rent increase. And she was tired, so impossibly tired of struggling. So she walked into the study. Jean was on a video call speaking rapid Korean into a headset. He didn't disconnect. Instead, He held up one finger weight and continued his conversation, speaking in a language Amara didn't understand, though the tone suggested he was explaining a decision that others disagreed with. She heard shipment and Sullivan and what might have been resolved, but mostly the words were incomprehensible. The meaning, however, was clear. This was a man accustomed to making life-altering decisions, to having his orders questioned by people beneath him, to wielding power without apology. The study itself was a revelation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in multiple languages. A desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark wood. Windows overlooking gardens that suggested an army of landscapers, and on one wall, a painting Korean traditional depicting what looked like a family ancestral ceremony. When he finally hung up, he turned to her with the full weight of his attention. "I'm going to ask you several questions, and I want honest answers," he began. "Not polite answers, not answers you think I want to hear. True answers." Amara nodded. "Do you have family depending on your income? Do you have debts? Significant debt?" She almost lied. The programming ran deep. Never show weakness to authority. Never admit vulnerability. Never let them know how desperate you are. "Yes," she said finally. "Very significant. Are you considering leaving Chicago?" This one made her pause. "Not if I can help it. This is where the opportunity is. This is where I can earn enough to matter." Gene leaned back in his chair. He was wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the tattoo on his left forearm. Korean characters in black ink that she didn't recognize but understood carried meaning. She would later learn it meant family above all. But in this moment, she only knew it represented something she didn't fully understand. "Daniel's diabetes is unusually complicated," he explained. "He's had it since he was 8 years old, but 3 years ago, his condition destabilized significantly. His glucose levels fluctuate unpredictably. Standard management isn't effective. He requires constant monitoring, anticipatory intervention," and he paused, looking for the word compassion, not clinical distance, actual care. "What happened 3 years ago?" Amara asked, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't her place. She was a potential employee, not a confidant. But Gene answered anyway. "His mother was murdered." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Amara felt them ripple through her understanding of everything she'd observed. The protective intensity, the scarred knuckles, the security presence, the way he'd moved with the precision of someone who knew violence intimately. "A business associate tried to strike at me through her," Gene continued, his voice carefully controlled, each word measured. "He thought if he removed what I cared about most, he could control me. Instead, he created a man with nothing left to lose. He created a man willing to destroy everything. But Daniel became something else. He became a reminder of what I'd failed to protect. And his condition worsened as if his body understood that I'd failed him and decided to punish me further." Amara said nothing. This wasn't information meant for responses. This was confession, the kind people made when they needed to justify themselves to someone whose opinion might matter. His previous medical companion, a woman he trusted, recently accepted a position elsewhere. Daniel refuses to accept a replacement. He's volatile, difficult, and he's currently in significant danger. Not just from his condition, but from— he paused again, calculating how much to reveal. "Other factors in my life." "What kind of factors?" Amara asked. "The kind you don't need to know about unless you accept my offer," Gene replied. "But you need to understand something, Miss Okafor. If you take this position, you will be embedded in a world that doesn't follow the rules you're accustomed to. A world where danger is not theoretical, where consequences are real, where the decision you make in the next 5 minutes could fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life." Amara's mouth was dry. "What's the offer?" "Live here. Be Daniel's medical monitor. Manage his condition. Accompany him to school, medical appointments, and certain social functions. $180,000 per year, plus housing, food, and education support. You can continue your nursing degree through an accelerated program I've arranged. Upon completion of the contract, 2 years minimum, you'll have $360,000 in savings plus full sponsorship for permanent residency status in the United States." The number was obscene. It was generational wealth for someone like her. It was the answer to every prayer she'd whispered to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. It was also a trap, and she knew it. But it was a trap with a door she could actually open. "Why me? You could hire anyone. Someone with more experience. Someone less complicated because you didn't run, Jean said simply. Because you made a medical assessment in an alley at night alone with a stranger and you did your job. Because the most valuable trait in my world isn't credentials. It's moral character. It's knowing someone won't sell out when pressure arrives. It's recognizing that some people are incapable of abandoning someone in need. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. I need to know Daniel is safe, not with someone hired for a paycheck. With someone who would stay in an alley in the freezing cold and help a stranger because it's the right thing to do. Amara thought of her mother in Lagos lying in a hospital bed waiting for a surgery that costs more than Amara's annual income. Of her brother learning to live with a chronic disease. Of the apartment where she'd never felt warm enough. Where the landlord threatened eviction every month. Where hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought of her father's death, of holding his hand while he died from something that could have been prevented with money she didn't have. She thought of the promises she'd made to herself about never being helpless again. I'll need to give notice at the hospital, she heard herself say. It's already been done, Jean replied. I have a very efficient administration. Your position here starts tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Mrs. Lee will show you to your quarters. He turned back to his computer, already disconnecting from her psychologically, already moving on to the next calculation, the next crisis, the next opportunity to exert control. Amara stood, her entire body vibrating with the magnitude of what she just agreed to. She'd stepped through a door. There was no closing it. Miss Okafor, Jean said, not looking up from his screen. Don't unpack everything. The ability to leave quickly is a valuable skill in my household. Daniel wasn't waiting in the study when Amara began work the next morning. He was in his bedroom, refusing to come down, his teenage defiance projecting through the mansion like a sonic weapon. The first morning, there was silence. The second morning, there was a text to his father. I don't need a babysitter. I especially don't need a babysitter. I've never met. Jin's response had been swift and devastating. Your glucose control has deteriorated. You nearly died in an alley. She's not negotiable. Accept it or lose your freedom. Your choice. But one comes faster than the other. Daniel had not come down for breakfast. Amara spent those first 2 days learning the mansion's rhythms. Mrs. Lee taught her the household schedules, the places where Jean conducted business that she should avoid, the security protocols that govern movement throughout the property. She learned that the third floor was off limits except for specific personnel, that certain rooms were monitored by cameras at all times, that Jin's business associates arrived through a separate entrance and never crossed paths with Daniel. She also learned that Daniel's room was a fortress of teenage isolation. Gaming equipment, art supplies scattered across every surface, medical supplies organized with the precision of someone who had learned to manage their own survival. Amara found him on the second floor landing on the third morning, sitting cross-legged on the marble tiles. His continuous glucose monitor reading 187, elevated, likely stress-induced. He had his father's eyes, but not his restraint. Every emotion moved across his face like weather. Anger, fear, resignation, all cycling through in rapid succession. I'm not the enemy, Amara said quietly, sitting down beside him without being invited. A risk maybe, but she'd learned that teenage boys respond better to someone who doesn't treat them like problems to be managed. I'm a nurse who's been hired to help manage your medical care. That's all. You're a spy, Daniel replied, not looking at her. Dad's trying to prove he can control everything. It's not enough that he controls Chicago's entire underworld. He has to control me, too. Amara processed this information carefully. Underworld, organized crime, the words she'd been avoiding, the implications she'd been suppressing. Okay, she said slowly. And how's that control working out for your health? Daniel looked at her, and she saw the crack in his armor, the moment of genuine vulnerability beneath the defensive anger. I'm tired, he said. I'm tired of being the thing he's terrified of losing. I'm tired of being the leverage in whatever wars he's fighting. And I'm tired of dying slowly while he pretends everything is fine. Your father isn't pretending, Amara said, and she meant it. I saw his face when I told him you were dying. That's not a man pretending. Something shifted in Daniel. A recognition perhaps, or a grudging acceptance that she wasn't here to be his jailer. They sat in silence for several minutes. Amara noticed things about him she hadn't observed in the alley. The way his hands moved, constantly, fidgeting with the glucose monitor, adjusting his shirt cuffs, the nervous energy of someone who had learned that stillness meant vulnerability. "There's a girl," he said after a long silence at the community college library. "She comes in on Thursdays around 6 p.m. Her name is Elena. She studies engineering. She's brilliant and funny and completely unaware that I exist, which is exactly how it needs to be." Amara understood what he was saying, what he was offering. "My father's people have been watching that library since I was 7 years old," Daniel continued. "They photographed everyone who studies there. They've recorded every conversation. There's nothing on her. No connections, no vulnerabilities. She's clean, so she's safe. But only as long as I don't exist for her. The moment I matter to her, she becomes leverage." The tragedy of his life settled over them like snow. "What does she study?" Amara asked. "Mechanical engineering. She's designing prosthetics for children in developing countries. Something about accessible healthcare and reducing production costs." Daniel's face transformed when he talked about her. The anger and fear replaced by something that looked like hope. "She presents her work every other Thursday. I've been to 12 of her presentations. She has no idea. Have you ever spoken to her? Once she asked if I could help her reach a book on the top shelf. I said yes. She said thank you. That was the entire conversation, and it's probably the best 2 minutes of my life." Amara felt her heart break for this boy who couldn't even experience a normal teenage crush without fearing for someone's safety. "I'll help," Amara said, "however I can." Daniel looked at her, and for the first time his expression wasn't guarded. "Thank you for not running," he said. Over the next weeks, Amara learned the architecture of Daniel's condition. His glucose didn't just fluctuate. It plummeted without warning, spiked from stress, responded to emotional states in ways that defied standard diabetic management. She learned that Thursdays were the hardest days when he went to the library to watch Elena present her work, and his glucose would drop from the stress of proximity. She learned that he tested his blood sugar 17 times a day, more than any diabetic she'd encountered. She learned that he slept with alarms set every 2 hours to check his levels. She also learned that he was brilliant, that his room was filled with sketches of architectural designs, mathematical equations, philosophical treatises written in margins of textbooks, that he spoke 3 languages fluently and was teaching himself a 4th, that his isolation had created space for a mind that consumed knowledge like oxygen. "Why architecture?" she asked one afternoon, finding him sketching what looked like a building design. "Because buildings last," Daniel replied. "People die, power shifts, empires fall, but buildings remain. They outlive the people who created them. They become monuments to the fact that someone existed and made something that mattered." Amara thought about that answer for a long time. 6 weeks in, Amara understood the architecture of Jin's world. It was a kingdom of power maintained through violence, money, and information. Security personnel moved through specific routes at specific times, like a choreographed dance performed by men trained to kill. Business meetings happened in locked rooms on the 3rd floor. Phone calls were conducted in multiple languages: Korean, Mandarin, Russian, English. The scarred men who served as bodyguards carried weapons with the unconscious confidence of people trained to use them as extensions of their bodies. And Jin moved through it all with the authority of someone born to power, someone who had inherited violence the way other people inherit money. Amara also understood that she was being tested. The first test came when she overheard a conversation about a shipment complication at the harbor and a negotiation with the Lee family, not the housekeeper, a different family entirely going poorly. She said nothing. She didn't ask questions. She pretended she hadn't heard. The second test came when Jin's security chief showed her surveillance photos of 3 men photographing her former apartment building. "For your safety, Marcus," the security chief had explained, "we're ensuring nothing interferes with your ability to do your job." She said nothing. She didn't panic. The third test came at a spring charity gala where Chicago's elite gathered to celebrate their wealth while pretending to care about charity. It was theater, the performance of morality by people who had forgotten what morality meant. Jean had decided that Daniel needed to be presented to Chicago society as healthy and stable, which meant Amara needed to be visible. A dress arrived in her quarters, emerald silk that probably cost more than her first month's salary. A note in Jin's precise handwriting for the gala. "You're necessary." The Sullivan family estate was a fortress disguised as a palace. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across walls that had witnessed centuries of Chicago's underworld politics. Waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than Amara's weekly salary. Chicago's elite circulated like sharks, scenting blood in the water, hunting for advantage, for weakness, for anyone who might be leveraged in their endless game of power. Amara stayed close to Daniel, monitoring his glucose, watching for the signs of stress that made his blood sugar volatile. Gene moved through the room with predatory grace, his handshakes lasting exactly long enough to be cordial, his eye contact never wavering. She realized, watching him work the room, that this was his arena. This was where he hunted. Patrick Sullivan appeared during dinner, a man with the kind of smile that made her instinctively reach for Daniel's hand. He greeted Gene with the false warmth of a longtime enemy, his movements calculated, his charm weaponized. "And who?" Patrick asked, his gaze finding Amara. "Is this fascinating addition to your household?" "Amara Watson," Gene replied, the lie delivered so smoothly that Amara nearly believed it herself. She was being renamed. She realized neutralized made less foreign, less other, less interesting. Jin's hand rested at the small of her back. And in that moment, Amara understood. She was being presented as his intimate. Not his lover, but someone close enough to matter, someone worth knowing about. It was a message written on her body, a claim staked in public. The orchestra began playing after dinner. Daniel's hands were trembling. A glucose check confirmed what she already knew. 71 milligrams per deciliter and dropping. The sophisticated environment, the alpha predators circulating, the tension between his father and Patrick Sullivan. It was burning through his glucose like an accelerant. "We need air," she murmured to Gene, keeping her voice light. Professional, they made it to the terrace just as Daniel's legs buckled. Amara worked methodically, her hands steady despite the audience from inside the ballroom. The other guests had noticed the young man's collapse, and they were watching with a hungry intensity of people witnessing scandal in the making. That's when Patrick Sullivan appeared in the terrace doorway, his expression predatory. "Well," he said softly, "isn't that interesting? Young Daniel Blackwood suffering from what appears to be a serious medical condition. I wonder how many people would find that detail valuable." Jin's body went very still. The transformation was barely visible. A shift in his breathing, a tightening of his jaw, but Amara recognized it from her rotations. It was the body language of someone calculating how many people they'd need to kill. "Get Daniel to the car," Gene ordered, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Now the car ride home was silent except for Jin's phone calls. Each one delivered in clipped Korean. Amara didn't understand the language, but she understood the meaning. Contingencies were being activated. Plans were being modified. Someone was going to pay. In the foyer, Gene turned to her with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was calculation. "Sullivan's men have already begun investigating your background," he said without preamble. "Questioning your neighbors, photographing your former associates, accessing your medical school records, the apartment building, her study group, her faculty advisor." Amara asked though she already knew. "Because you're connected to me, and in my world, connection is weakness." Gene moved to his study window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "Sullivan believes that understanding you will give him leverage. That if he can find something in your past, something you're running from, someone you care about, he can use it to compromise me. My mother," Amara said quietly, "my siblings in Lagos. They're vulnerable. They will be protected," Gene replied. "I have associates in Lagos. Your mother will have medical care. Your brother's treatment will be funded. But understand this, Miss Okafor. You are now embedded in a war. There's no stepping out. There's no going back." Amara felt the walls of the mansion close in around her. She'd made a choice in an alley on a frozen night, and now that choice was consuming her entire existence. "I didn't agree to this," she said, anger cutting through her fear. "I agreed to be a nurse." "You agreed to be part of my household," Gene corrected, turning to face her. "And in my household, everyone's loyalty is eventually tested." The weight of what she'd accepted settled over her like a burial shroud. Dawn was breaking when Jin's security chief burst into the study without knocking. A breach of protocol that instantly put Amara on alert. "Sir, we have confirmation. Sullivan's holding Victoria at the industrial warehouse. He's using her as bait." Amara watched Jin's face transform. The name Victoria carried weight. She didn't understand, but could feel in the sudden tension that filled the room. "Who's Victoria?" she asked. Jin's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that looked like raw grief mixed with desperate, dangerous hope. "My wife," he said quietly. "Daniel's mother. The woman I thought died 3 years ago." The warehouse rescue played out like a nightmare filmed in slow motion. Armed men emerging from shadows. Gunfire echoing through concrete corridors. Amara pressed against walls, her medical training useless against the chaos of violence. She followed Jean and Marcus through the maze of shipping containers, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the gunfire. When they found Victoria on the 3rd floor, Amara's clinical mind took over. She was in a metal chair, restrained, but not physically damaged. At least not in ways she could immediately see. The psychological damage, however, was written across her face. Her eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had been stripped of everything. Amara's training kicked in. She released the restraints, assessed her vitals, prepared her for movement. Victoria didn't speak. She simply looked at Jean with an expression that contained every emotion that existed. Relief, gratitude, trauma, terror. "We need to move," Marcus said. And they were running, Amara supporting Victoria, Jean covering their exit with precision and lethal efficiency. When they emerged from the warehouse, Jean was wounded. A gunshot to the shoulder, a deep cut across his ribs, but Victoria was alive. The woman he thought he'd lost forever was breathing because Amara had stayed when anyone else would have run. 6 hours later, in a private medical facility that didn't exist on any municipal records, Jean found Amara sitting in a hallway, still covered in other people's blood. "Thank you," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "You kept her alive. You kept me from losing her again." Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the monster. A man who'd lost everything he'd cared about once before. A man terrified of losing it again. "I need you to make a choice," he said quietly. "You can walk away from this. I can arrange for your return to civilian life. Your family will receive the money I promised, the protection, everything we agreed upon. Or you can stay, knowing exactly what I am, what I've done, what I'll need to do to keep you and Daniel and Victoria and everyone else I care about alive." Amara thought of the warehouse, of Victoria's empty eyes, of the sound of gunfire, of her mother in Lagos, now protected by Jin's network, of Daniel slowly learning to trust again. "I'm staying," she said, "but only because someone needs to keep you human, and I think that's going to be a full-time job." 3 months later, Amara was sitting in the mansion's library when Jean entered with a proposition that was both generous and terrifying. "Victoria is recovering," he said. "Daniel is learning to trust again. This household is becoming something that resembles a family, and I want to expand your role." He sat across from her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as Daniel's nurse, not as my employee. Stay because this house hasn't felt like a home until you were in it. Stay because you showed me there's more to strength than power. Stay because I need someone who reminds me every day that there are lines I shouldn't cross." Amara looked at him. This complicated, dangerous, broken man who had somehow become the center of a world she never knew existed. "I'll stay," she said, "but under one condition, that we build something different with Daniel, not a version of you, not a power player in your empire. We give him the choice to be something else, something better." For a long moment, Jean said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed," he said. For him, we built something different. Outside the library windows, Chicago stretched into the distance. A city of millions, each with their own story of survival, their own choices that changed everything. Amara Okafor had made hers in an alley on a frozen January night. And now she was building something new from the pieces of all their broken lives. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was hers. And for the first time since leaving Lagos, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.